Right, I want to turn now to the issue of coronavirus and the Chinese Communist Party. And I want to find out what it is that this disease and the way that its outbreak was handled tells us about the CCP. And when I say this, when I say China, I'm not actually referring to Chinese people. I count many among my friends have got no issues with Chinese people at all. But I'm talking about the government. I'm talking about the Chinese Communist Party. Now, China, first admitted to the World Health Organization that they had several cases of COVID-19 on December the 31st. It was identified as a new coronavirus on January the 7th, and the first death was reported on January the 9th. Now, by the end of January, coronavirus cases had been reported in Thailand, Japan, South Korea, Singapore, the USA, Australia, France, Malaysia, Canada, Nepal, Cambodia, Germany, Sri Lanka, United Arab Emirates, the Philippines, India, the UK, Russia, Sweden, and Spain. And meanwhile, the World Health Organization declared a public health emergency of international concern on January the 30th, so about a month later. And China's role throughout all of that time, and indeed subsequently, has been predictable in many ways. It's sort of been Communist Playbook 101. Dr. Li Wenliang, for example, has become the figurehead of a group of, it seems, about 8 doctors who were called by the Chinese government rumour mongers. These doctors blew the whistle on the new disease before the authorities actually went to the World Health Organization. But police from the Wuhan Public Security Bureau interrogated Dr. Li on January the 3rd, giving him a warning notice and censoring him for making false comments on the internet. And by that, it's a WeChat group with him and his colleagues where he was sharing this information, and they were, getting intel on it and talking about it. And he was made to sign a letter of admonition promising not to do it again. And the police warned him that if he failed to abide by the admonition terms, he would be prosecuted. Shortly afterward, on January the 8th, Dr. Li actually contracted the virus, and he passed away from the infection himself on February the 7th. He's 33 years old, left behind tragically his pregnant wife and young son. Now, it's understood that Dr. Li was not the first person to raise concerns from the medical community, nor to be targeted by the Chinese Communist government. His story really came to light a bit later. It really came to light when his condition was quite poor and he was deteriorating in hospital. Others, obviously, no doubt, too fearful to speak. But interestingly, Dr. Li was a Christian. That's just a side note on the issue. But speaking of cover-ups, the South China Morning Post has now reported, and this is now just the other day, that the government underreported coronavirus cases by 43,000, meaning that 81,600 reported cases in reality is more like 120,000. These 43,000 extra cases are people who actually tested positive for coronavirus but didn't show obvious symptoms. And that nonetheless is positive tests, that's cases, but because they were asymptomatic, they didn't go in the official tally. And so that underreporting actually means that the World Health Organization had until now assumed that so-called silent carriers, that is people who are asymptomatic but have the disease, they assumed they weren't a big problem. But scientists around the world are now discovering that nothing could be further from the truth. And unlike other countries, China conveniently removed these so-called silent cases from its total. So not only has the CCP likely prevented the timely discovery and reporting of the existence of COVID-19, it's also contributed to a very serious misunderstanding about how it spreads in the community. Why? Well, because the CCP does not rank truth as a high value. In fact, for the communists, there is no higher authority than the state. And when you're in that situation, you wind up with a couple of things. You wind up firstly with atheism as the preferred, if not the enforced religion, and a situation also then where the state is no longer the servant of truth, but as the highest and ultimate authority, the state becomes an author of truth. It actually decides or can decide what is true. And I was reminded about this in relation to the Chernobyl nuclear disaster in 1986. In that situation, the Soviet Union's response was initially flat-footed. It was initially denialist because their position was that a nuclear disaster wasn't possible in the Soviet Union, therefore it could not happen. But of course, under those circumstances, as we see in China right now, another concern quickly starts to overtake, which is the prospect of embarrassment in the eyes of the world. And so something was done. but not before lives were spent, not before those first crucial actions in reply to the problem were compromised in the earliest moments after disaster. And also in China in those early days when this disease was coming to light. It's the same with communist China. Dr. Li and others were silenced by the authorities for spreading rumors. In other words, for speaking truth. But it wasn't true according to the state. It couldn't be true according to the state. It was a truth that the state had decided was impossible. And it wasn't until they realized that they had to tell the World Health Organization for fear of global shame that these matters were actually taken seriously. And by that time, the disease had most likely already gotten outside of China. For good reason then. Many have continued to doubt China's long-term transparency on this issue of coronavirus. It's interesting, actually, the country that dealt with coronavirus the most effectively, arguably, is Taiwan, and that is a country that knows better than anyone and is more concerned than anybody about this reality of the Chinese Communist Party. China told the World Health Organization they had a few cases on December the 31st, right? And it wasn't for another month that the World Health Organization actually declared a public health, a health emergency with global implications. And yet Taiwan started screening arrivals from China on the 1st of January. They didn't know what the virus was. They wouldn't know for another week. So they screened them for 36 different known viruses. And this is a country with monstrous cross-border traffic between Taiwan and China, and direct flights to every capital city. And they've actually kept their cases as at now to about 200. And that's because they were ready. They didn't wait for China to tell the truth. They weren't stupid enough to assume that China would tell the truth. They weren't stupid enough to assume that their comment to the World Health Organization on the 31st of December was true. They thought there's more to this, and they got straight into it because Taiwan understands. They understand that the Chinese government will lie, and they're more interested in their own survival than the survival even of their own people. But here's the point of all of this. 3 brief points I want to make out of all of this. I paint that picture, I express that danger, I express the communist way of doing things under these circumstances because actually, first of all, I believe in Australia and to a lesser extent the West at large, we face something of a moral crisis with China. We're a little bit blind to the realities of that regime, how dangerous those realities are, because, you know, for anyone who is a little bit blind, whether willfully or whether genuinely, there is such opportunity. There's promises of endless economic growth if you throw your lot in with China. There's promises of ludicrous wealth, bags of money for people who will go all the way with China. And, you know, some people are prepared to look past the lies, the bitter fruits of those lies, the dreadful corruption of this regime. I mean, this is just scratching the surface. I think about a year ago, I did a segment on China's attitude to Christians and religious minorities, and it's absolutely shocking to see pastors disappearing in the night, to see churches being desecrated, to have government agents coming in and watching, and all sorts of terrible, terrible human rights abuses. This is just the beginning. And you know, Australia is in a position where we're very nearly the most prosperous country on earth. And the reason for that in many ways comes down to one word, and it is China. This is a dangerous regime upon which we depend at our peril. And it may end up one day in the future being a great Achilles heel of Australia, a nation that's been preserved from so much trouble and difficulty. Well, you know, if China gets too powerful, we may rue the day that we went all in with China. And maybe that's a bit strong in terms of terminology. Maybe we're not all in with China. But as I fear, as politicians rank economic prosperity and growth and numbers as the number one, the highest priority, then we will continue to turn a blind eye to just how dangerous this regime can be. Taiwan is maybe more honest about China than countries in the West can afford to be. Second, I want to make a point about God and government. In the West, we once believed earnestly that the highest authority was Almighty God, with the state as his servant. In fact, that's why the phrase Almighty God actually appears in the preamble to our Australian Constitution. Humbly relying on Almighty God, it says there. We believed in God and Caesar, and we honoured both in their proper place. The state was a servant of God. That's Romans 13 language. Government, we still have government ministers, right? Ministers of God, a minister for finance, a minister for health, a minister for education. That's because of biblical language, calling them ministers. But you know, as godlessness, atheism or lack of understanding of God as a highest and greatest being rises in the West, so too will the state. It has to happen that way. And you know, beware the state that has no higher authority. I mean, we're contributing to this. We look to the state, the government, to solve everything from toilet paper to family breakdown to bushfire season to my own mental health. We look to them to give us rights. We're now in a situation where the government apparently prescribes rights and freedoms, or to make us happy. They ought not to have the power to do these things. As Christians, we too often look to the government to love our neighbour for us, to do all the welfare, and to say, well, that's a Christian thing to do. Well, no, it's your obligation first, don't forget. And let me say, beware that state that has no higher authority, when government is the greatest and the biggest, because you risk this. It's no longer a servant of truth, but it may in fact start creeping into that situation where it is an author of truth. And that is a bad road to go down. And I think that as the West sees our government's hypertrophy grow out of all size and proportion, we should be concerned about that. Finally, and really this is the biggest deal for me, sometimes we encounter moments that serve as powerful object lessons. This is one of those moments. You know, it's a powerful object lesson that tells us just how important truth is. We live in days when truth is not highly valued. In fact, it's actually it's less and less valued even in Christian communities, because bad theology tells us it's not loving or something like this. I'll probably deal with that in another subject, which is rot. But we let that idea that truth isn't to be so highly prized and treasured rub off on us at our peril. There is in fact nothing, and I repeat, nothing more important than truth. Without truth, we're all doomed. It's a great quote I heard the other day which makes this present point very powerfully. It's this: every time we tell a lie, we incur a debt to the truth. Sooner or later that debt must be repaid. And in the context of what I've been saying, two huge debts would be COVID-19 and Chernobyl, right? Those are shocking and staggering debts to pay off the back of lies that led to the bitter fruits of those lies. If the truth had been told, how much sooner could this have been contained and solved? But you know, this doesn't just relate to geopolitics. This relates to those sweet lies that we hold on to every day of our lives, in our own personal lives, for ourselves, that we want to believe. I'm here to say the pain will come. The pain will come. If you do not live consistent with what is true, you're not living consistent with what is right and good, and the pain will come. It doesn't matter how you justify ignoring the truth. It doesn't matter how good you feel ignoring the truth. It doesn't matter how important your feelings might seem to be in the face of the truth. It doesn't matter whether you make your own truth. It doesn't matter whether you just don't care about pursuing truth. It doesn't interest you. I'm here to tell you the pain will come if you are believing lies. The pain will come if you are racking up debts to truth, because the truth has a way of making itself known. You know, Romans 1, I just thought of this, Romans 1, it says, what's the problem with people in a society like ours? They suppress the truth in unrighteousness, right? That's what this is all about. It's just saying, well, I don't care what's true. It's not seeking truth. It's not letting it shape us. It's not valuing and prizing truth. And then what happens? He said they receive in themselves the due penalty for their error. Comes back to bite hard, and it destroys. You know, it's high time truth was fashionable again. So I'm going to say, seek truth with all your might. There is nothing more important, and we've lost sight of that to our personal and societal peril. That was the truth about coronavirus and the Chinese Communist Party. Hey, one more thing. You know, I've been looking at the metrics and I've figured out something. You guys are watching the videos and not subscribing. So please help us out a great deal by hitting the like button and then hitting subscribe, hitting the bell as well so you get the notifications. It helps us out a really great deal, and you can click here to see more videos.